All right, looking at the lesson is the character and cunning of the destructionist. The character and cunning of the destructionist. And just on page 129 it says the term destructionist is rarely used in the common language. By definition, it refers to one who delights in destroying that which is valuable, or whose principles and influence tend to destroy existing institutions, an advocate for the destruction of an existing political institution or the like. The word destructionist has been revamped, or I guess we might say repackaged in the word deconstructionist. And as John has given his definition of destructionist in the book, the term deconstructionist is the term that you might hear, if you listen to political commentary, you watch, various shows, or, political op-ed, you read political op-ed, you probably should be at least somewhat familiar with the term deconstructionist. And that is the same thing as what John is going to talk about as a destructionist, but a deconstructionist. That word, and this is why I wanted to kind of move to that word from a more practical and historical viewpoint. Deconstructionism is a method of interpretation which seeks to take a text completely apart all the way down to its basic fundamental meanings and context in order to determine meaning. From there arose the idea of biblical deconstructionists. And biblical deconstructionists, and I did a little research, and I'm gonna read some things here that I was able to find, and then we'll talk about some examples of biblical deconstructionists. And how that affects, you think, well, how does that affect us? It affects us in a very, very significant way, both biblically and socially. All right? And so, but the idea of deconstructionism is a form of biblical textual criticism or interpretation. Again, this is not the classic definition of it. This is what it's turned into, okay? Or interpretation that denies there is any single correct meaning or interpretation of a passage or text. Now we understand why this is such an important thing for us to know. That those who hold to this idea, and by the way, many, if not most of our religious friends and neighbors hold this view, whether or not they've ever even heard the word deconstructionist or even understand the concept.
When you're talking to someone, that's the first time I noticed that, and I'd heard it, I never put two and two together. When you come to a point that you butt heads and they say, that's why you have your Bible and I have mine.
Right.
That's horrible.
It's terrible, but it denies that the Bible. Ultimately, it denies that the Bible teaches any single thing objectively. It says at the heart of the deconstructionist theory is this. First, no passage or text can possibly convey a single, reliable, consistent, coherent message to everyone who reads or hears it. In other words, God is not capable of writing a book or communicating to men in a way that all of them can understand it. So it's really not an attack on the biblical text, it's an attack on God. Secondly, the author who wrote the text is less responsible for the content than are the forces of culture, such as language and the author's unconscious ideology. In other words, the men that wrote the Bible have unconscious ideologies. They have unconscious, in other words, they have biases and prejudices that they may or may not be aware of, and the things that they wrote are guided by those unrealized or unrecognized biases or prejudices. Now, probably none of y'all have heard this, but I've read it and heard it a million times through the course of my studies. This type of ideology is the type of ideology that produces statements such as, Paul hated women. The Apostle Paul hated women. See, he was an unconscious woman hater. And so therefore all of Paul's writings, which again they say is designed to subjugate women as second-class citizens, etc., that's what Paul did. All of Paul's writings were completed but Paul hated women, and subconsciously he wrote in such a way as to make women second-class citizens. Now, I mean, I've read and heard that 1,000 times. I mean, it's utter foolishness. I mean, when you read what Paul actually wrote. But then there are other even more pernicious things that are said. By the way, and the Apostle Paul, because he wrote half of the New Testament, or at least half the books of the New Testament, is a common target among the Deconstructionists, because a lot of the practical application of Christianity is found in Paul's epistles. And a lot of doctrine is found in Paul's epistles. And when people don't like the application or the doctrine, then they've got to find some way to undermine they got to undermine Paul. Therefore, when they undermine Paul, they can discredit what Paul wrote or Paul said. Let me give you a quick example of this. Years ago, Bill Maher had a show, a TV show, and for the life of me, the name of it just escaped me. But the premise of the program was that there were supposed to be two conservative thinkers on one side of the panel and two liberal commentators on the other side of the panel, and whatever Maher decided to discuss that day would be balanced by both points of view. Okay, and on at least one occasion, and you can still find this on YouTube, on one occasion he had Ben Stein as one of the conservatives. And Ben Stein's a really good thinker, writer, been involved in politics. But Ben Stein was a speechwriter at one time for Richard Nixon. All right, so during the course of this back and forth, Stein's just killing them with facts. I mean, he's just killing them with statistics and facts and truth. And they start really feeling the heat of his argument. All right. So what was the response of one of the women, or the woman that was on the other side of this argument? She said, "Well, you worked for Nixon. Why should I listen to anything you said?" In other words, his association with Richard Nixon allowed her to discount every single fact that he was talking about. That's what deconstructionism does to the biblical text, particularly the Apostle Paul. Paul was a woman hater. Paul was homophobic. By the way, do a Google search, and if you don't believe me, just do a Google search. Was Paul homophobic? And you'll get thousands, if not millions of hits, or hundreds of thousands of hits. Now, some of them will be denial of that statement, but many of them will be affirming that statement, that Paul hated homosexuals, and that's why he wrote so powerfully and clearly against homosexual practice, because he was biased against homosexuals. And then we'll go even one step further with how this works. And I've read this and heard this. Paul was a closet homosexual. And in his self-loathing of the lifestyle that he was trying to hide, he wrote adamantly against the very lifestyle that he wished he could live. That Paul himself was a closet homosexual. By the way, do a Google search of that, and you'll find people that will affirm, that type of lunacy. Right? But that's what deconstructionism strives to do. It says the Bible has to be interpreted by basically says what I believe the author and the culture intended to say and why he said it. And so, this is again the first is no passage can teach absolute truth. The second is that all biblical authors had unconscious ideologies. All right, and so the deconstructionist denies that there is any such thing as absolute truth, which in and of itself is contradictory, because in an attempt to deny absolute truth, they're trying to affirm an absolute truth that there is no absolute truth. And so that the denial of absolute truth itself is self-contradictory. But that's the attitude that people have. By the way, and this goes to what John was talking about, not necessarily the statement, you have your Bible and how I have mine, but you have your church and I have mine. You have your belief and I have mine, as if all opinions and all beliefs are equally valid, which they are not. By the way, not even all opinions are equally valid.
The whole idea of what you just said denies the work and existence of the Holy Spirit.
That's right. That it denies the work and primarily the work of the Holy Spirit in giving us the Bible. That's exactly right. Yeah. Now, right. Now, let me ask you a quick question, because you might think, well, everybody's opinion is of equal value, but it's not. All right? I'll give you just a real quick example. If your car's making a funny noise while it's idling, whose opinion do you want, mine or John's? Whose opinion? If you just want somebody's opinion, who do you want, mine or John's? You don't want mine, do you? No. And again, that's just, and by the way, that's just a very simple case that's showing that even not all opinions are equally valid. All right, and so, but to go back to the idea of deconstructionism. Deconstructionism celebrates human autonomy and determines truth through human intellect. It says that all truth is relative. There's no such thing as absolute truth, and the deconstructionist thinks he can discover a personal or social motivation behind what the Scripture says and therefore determine what is really being said. Now, I know this is what it says, but here's what's really being said. Because Paul was biased against women, because Paul was a homophobe or whatever. This is what he's really saying. And by the way, they do the same thing to the teachings of Jesus as well. And let me add this. We can do the same thing to the teaching of Jesus. When the teachings of Paul or Jesus are difficult for us, we can also look for loopholes. I mean, in other words, this is not just something that's out there in the world or the religious world. This is something that we also have to struggle with every single day if we're going to be honest with ourselves in our own daily personal Bible reading and Bible study. Is that I have to be careful that I'm not going to look for a loophole, which is the same thing as being a deconstructionist. And so, and while I might give lip service to the inspiration of the Bible, if I'm looking for a loophole, then I'm no better off than the people that deny the inspiration of the Bible. Ultimately, I'm not any better off. I have no moral authority or high ground in that regard. And then the deconstructionist does not study the Bible in order to find out the meaning intended by the writer, but to attempt to discern the cultural and social motives behind what was written. All right, now, anytime you start reading 1 Timothy chapter 2, beginning in verse 8 through verse 15, which talks about that men are to pray everywhere, women are to learn in silence, be in subjection, not to teach or exercise authority over men, what you're going to find is, you're going to find the deconstructionist says, well, this is an Ephesus-specific problem. Because Ephesus was the center of the worship of the goddess Diana. And because you have this female goddess who has prominence in the city, There's also culturally a dominance of women in the culture, and therefore Paul is writing specifically to Ephesus about a situation with Diana is creating cultural problems at Ephesus, and therefore whatever Paul said to Timothy in 1 Timothy 2 is not to be just used blanket across all of the spectrum of the New Testament. See how that works? Notice, we know what Paul said in 1 Timothy 2 about men and women, but here's the real reason why he wrote it, and here's the real reason why we don't have to pay attention to it today. That's deconstructionism. All right? And then you have, then the question is asked, what if legal documents such as wills and deeds were read like this? There wouldn't be any count, would there? You wouldn't know what a landline was, right? And by the way, when we write deeds nowadays, of course they're written with latitude and longitude and fixed markers. But even still in our part of the world, there's still physical landmarks involved in deeds. Isn't that right? Isn't that right, John? Sometimes even a fence row can be included as in a deed. Because there's some strange laws in the state of Alabama about fence rows. Like that if you can put a fence row over on 10 feet over on your neighbor's property and he doesn't fix it over the course of 7 or however many years, that property becomes your property. I mean, just crazy things like that. And you think, that's crazy. Well, it's not that crazy because it's happened right here in our community. And so, what would it mean? What would it mean if landlines and markers and all those were subject to everybody's personal interpretation? You end up, like I said, as Lynn said, they wouldn't mean anything. Therefore, the same thing applies to the Bible. You start dealing with the Bible like this, then the Bible doesn't mean. If the Bible means everything, it doesn't mean anything. Kind of like in today's society, everybody's a racist. But when everybody's a racist, nobody's a racist. In other words, you throw out the racist / homophobe / transphobe or whatever slur that the left likes to use, and everybody's that. But when everybody's that, nobody's that. When everybody's Hitler, nobody's Hitler. You see. And so this is the attitude. This is the attitude that is so dangerous for us because it affects how people read and understand the Bible, and it also affects how we have to deal with people when we talk to them about the Bible. We can't just assume, like we could say 50 years ago, that most people in our community at least accepted the Bible as the Word of God and had enough integrity or honesty. I might have to go back farther than 50 years, all right? But that when people could be shown in the Bible what a thing was and what it meant, that they would be willing to change or at least admit, okay, I know it says that, but I'm not going to change. Now people just say, well, that's just your interpretation. And so, our attitude, the attitude of the world toward the Bible has changed drastically in the last 20 to 40 years. And so it affects how we have to deal with people. In other words, we have to explain a lot of things more than we used to. We have to use illustrations and, for lack of a better term, syllogisms or rules of logic to help bring people to a knowledge of the truth. All right, so now I'm going to look back at the book, but not because I'm going to look at what's in the book. I'm going to look at the notes I've got in the book. But note at the bottom, or look at the middle paragraph first. The world has always been tempted by cunning destructionists who attempt to change or rethink or redefine issues. Their objective is to, and here's my word again, deconstruct the old and reconstruct the new, and this is a display of arrogant anarchy. I hear this a lot. I'm a big fan. I'm a big fan of Jordan Peterson. I love to listen to Jordan Peterson. And one of the things that he says a lot, and has said a lot over the last 5 to 7 years, is when you hear someone say, socialism will work, just the right people haven't tried it yet. I mean, you hear that a lot, right? Communism is a good thing. The right person just hasn't been in charge yet. Marxism is a good thing. The right person just hasn't been in charge yet. And Peterson says that's the most arrogant thing that anybody could ever say, because it assumes, because the person who says that says, if I were in charge with absolute authority, I'm the one that could bring in, peace and utopia. Except that he says it's been tried in almost every part of the world, in different cultures, by people with different backgrounds. He says, and the result has always been the same. Piles and piles and piles of millions of dead bodies. 100 million dead people in the 20th century is the result of socialism, communism, fascism, Nazism, Marxism. In other words, this thing's been tried everywhere, and the result is always the same. And for a person to say, oh, it doesn't work because the right person hasn't implemented it yet, is the ultimate of arrogance. Now look, as wicked as many of these leaders, Chairman Mao, Stalin, Marx, Hitler, as wicked as these men are, one would be a fool to underestimate their intelligence and their cunning. You don't get to be where those people are, just by being a dud, by being a dimwit. I mean, those guys were, in all likelihood, were probably likely geniuses in a lot of ways, but they didn't have any moral moorings. They didn't have anything to restrain them. And so this idea that if I were in charge, I could do it right is arrogant. That's what happens when people start deconstructing the Bible. In other words, if you just let me tell you what it means, things will be a whole lot better. And then it says in bottom of page 129, the root of all specific evils found in the world is anarchy, the rejection of the rule of law for civility. And then it talks about, this all began in the Garden of Eden. Look, God gave Adam and Eve a specific set of instructions, right? Is that right? Is there anything difficult to understand about what God told Adam and Eve to do? Is there anything difficult to understand about what God told Adam and Eve not to do? So what did Satan do? What did Satan do? He deconstructed it. He says, no. God said you'll die, but you'll not surely die. Now, at first glance, nobody's going to accept that, right? God says you'll die. I'm telling you, you'll not die. Now, they didn't have any reason to believe Satan when he first said that, right? So what did Satan do? He deconstructed what God said. In other words, he goes, the only reason God told you this is because he knows that if you do this, what? You will be like him. And God doesn't want you to be like him. So he deconstructed what God had actually said to go back, again, you understand I'm speaking facetiously, to explain to them, now, this is what he said, but this is why he said it, and his motives weren't good, and his intentions weren't good, because he knows if you do this, this will be good for you, and God really doesn't want what is good for you. See how he deconstructed it? He went right back to the integrity of God. He talked about God's intent, God's motives, and then he convinced them that he was right. But they had no reason to believe at first that they would not die. Satan had to deconstruct what God had to say. Now, thinking about this idea of deconstruction, I just read, and I use the term loosely, from some of our brethren. Back in the early 90s, there was a magazine that came out, I believe it was in 1993. A magazine began to be published by some far left-wing members of the church. And the magazine was called Wineskins. And Wineskins sought to deconstruct the idea, the New Testament plan for the church. And the first thing they did was that they referred to two different churches of Christ. And here's how they described them. There's the Big C Church of Christ, Big C Church. In other words, Church of Christ, Big C Church, Big C Christ, right? There's the Big C Church of Christ, which is the Church of Christ that all y'all are seeing in existence today. Then there's the Little C Church of Christ, which is the church that's actually found in the Bible. And our job and our mission is to take the Big C Church of Christ and make it closer to the Little C, the Big C Church of Christ in the world, and draw it closer to the Little C Church of Christ that's found in Scripture. See what they've done? They've practiced deconstruction. Now, William Woodson just absolutely destroyed this. He had a book that was published in 1999 called Change Agents in the Churches of Christ. That actually, the book was a result of the Bible classes that he taught at Athens and Winfield, Alabama, in Winfield on Thursday nights. And Woodson said there's some, he goes, first of all, he goes, who appointed you as the official church movers? In other words, who gave you the right to be the official church mover? And he says, and how far do you intend to move what you call the Big C Church? In other words, who appointed you the mover? How far do you intend to move? By what determination have you determined how far it needs to move? And are you going to try to move everybody else that's out there in the world? Or are you just going to pick on the Big C Church of Christ? You see, he asked some questions that they didn't want to have to answer. But what kind of arrogance is projected by a group of people that said, we're going to take the church as it exists and we're going to reconstruct it to make it closer to the church that's in the Scriptures? That's arrogant. I mean, that is absolute arrogance. And that's what deconstructionists try to do. I read this just this week. By the way, this is how I got to wineskins. I was reading an article on wineskins. It was posted on wineskins' Facebook page. And it said, you are no longer allowed to use the gopher wood argument against instrumental music. And then they went into this big convoluted explanation as to, since we really don't know what gopher wood is, we can't use gopher wood as an example of limiting ourselves to what is expressly stated, confining ourselves to what is expressly stated as opposed to doing other things. So that's deconstructionism. Look, I don't care what kind of wood it is. By the way, they even offered the idea that it meant that it had to be cut wood. Cut wood. Like squared off, planed. All right? Question. Does that change anything? If it's a type of wood or a configuration of wood, does that change anything? No, it doesn't change anything. It still had to be exactly what God said, whether it is a type of wood as if it were pine or if it was a cut of wood such as tongue and groove. Whatever it was, Noah had to abide by it, and he wasn't at liberty to change anything. Some years ago, they started saying you can't use Nadab and Abihu as examples in worship anymore. And again, a lot of convoluted reasoning offered up. But so you see what people are doing here. They're trying to take things that have been used for many, many years effectively and correctly and make these things, or to declare these things as no longer valid, no longer authoritative, no longer meaningful in today's society. And so these are the things. And just by way of what's going on right now. The very word transgender doesn't mean anything. It's a meaningless word. There is no such thing as a transgender person. That person does not exist. There's no such thing. Until somebody figures out how to get from an XX to an XY or an XY to an XX, there is no such thing as a transgendered person. That creature, that's like a unicorn. It only exists in people's minds. But what has happened? Our society has tried to deconstruct our language. There's about 50 sets of pronouns now that are out there. 50 that people want to claim for themselves. And by the way, if you read any kind of secular publication, such as Time Magazine, New York Times, People Magazine, you'll find singular individuals identified as they and them. Instead of saying he did this, it says they did this, but it means he did this. Now, that literally destroys the English language. When you can change pronouns from singular to plural. Listen, I tried to read an article one time about somebody who wanted the they and them pronouns. That was the awfulest mess I ever saw in my whole life. All right, let me just cut to the chase. It's stupid. It's stupid. And it's an attempt to deconstruct our language so that words don't mean anything anymore. And this idea of separating, by the way, and I've said this before, gender was never used in reference to people. Gender was always used as a linguistic tool to refer to words. The word that is commonly understood as gender is the word sex. For example, when a baby is born, the birth certificate doesn't say gender, it says sex, male or female. Through the course of usage, because words had to be masculine, feminine, or neuter, he, being masculine, she being feminine, it being neuter, that the idea of gender carried over from words to people. All right? That's just, it just happened that way. And by the way, when people use the word such as gender, we understood what they meant. They meant biological sex. XX, XY. But now they've taken the word gender and said, well, gender is simply a social construct. And you can't really assign a baby's gender at birth. You have to let them grow up and decide what they want to be. When people use idiotic phrases such as birthing people instead of the word mother or mothers. By the way, we got people in our government that do that. Refer to mothers as birthing people. All right? By the way, our current Congress and those that are running it have disallowed the use of words such as uncle and aunt, nephew and niece. You know why? Because they're too gender specific. That's the kind of people running this country. What are they doing? They're deconstructing language. They're deconstructing our understanding of, they're trying to deconstruct people's understanding of the world and how it works so they can reconstruct it in a way that they want. Now, that type of stuff affects the church. More so in the sense of trying to reach the world with truth than it does, what we deal with in Northwest Alabama. But I just want to kind of give you a grasp of what we're dealing with on a large scale with regard to deconstructionism as it applies first of all to our social fabric, and then how for a long time it's actually been used. I'd say this, it's been used for longer amount of time in dealing with the Bible than has been with society. Because people have been trying to deconstruct the biblical text for a long time. They've only been trying to deconstruct society for about 30 or 40 years. But now that we've got a grasp on that, we're going to start next Sunday on page 130. Page 130. We'll start with Roman numeral 2, just above the word body, as an introduction to the rest of the lesson. By the way, next Sunday is supposed to be the day that the young adult class starts in this classroom across from my old office. Hey, Philip, will you grab that box of books, the green books that are in the library there, and put those out? And John and Philip are going to take that class starting next Sunday. So if you consider yourself a young adult, yeah, that'll work. Kathy Ballard says she's in. All right, we'll stop there and pick up. Those of us that'll be in here will pick up page 130 next week.